The thermometer outside the door of Ida Voss's farmhouse read 8 degrees Fahrenheit above zero on the morning of March 14th, 1893. That was a problem, not because 8 degrees Fahrenheit is especially cold for Stearns County, Minnesota, but because the woodpile beside the east wall of her house was gone. She'd burned the last cord 4 days earlier. She'd already fed the kitchen stove, her husband's broken wagon handle, a 3-legged milking stool, and 2 fence posts she'd pulled out of frozen ground with her bare hands. The stove ate all of it in a single morning. She was 31 years old, alone on 160 acres, and she had enough wheat to last through April, but what she didn't have was fuel. Her nearest neighbour, Henrik Brower, ran 22 head of cattle and had a proper woodshed, stacked floor to ceiling with split oak, 14 cords of it, bought off a timber wagon from the street, Cloud Rail Depot the previous September. He'd told her twice that spring that she'd never last on that place without a husband to handle the heavy work. He'd offered twice to buy her claim. Both times she'd sent him away without much ceremony. Now, with March refusing to act like anything but February, she walked out behind the house to the old stone silo her husband Ernst had left half-finished when he died of pneumonia in October of 1891, and she pulled open the iron latch on the access door at the base. What she found inside that silo changed how she heated her home for the next 6 weeks, and it would make Henrik Brower, eventually, regret every word he'd said to her. But before we talk about what Ida found, we need to talk about a problem that almost no one in this country thinks about anymore, a problem that killed more Great Plains settlers than any blizzard, any drought, any flood. The American frontier west of the Mississippi had almost no trees. Think about what that actually meant. You've claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act. You've built a house, dug a well, planted your first wheat. Winter is coming. And there is nothing, not a stick, not a branch, growing within 3 miles of your door that's large enough to burn. The Great Plains is a grassland ecosystem, not a forest. The trees grow along creek banks, in narrow ribbons of cottonwood and box elder that couldn't hope to supply fuel for thousands of incoming families. Major Stephen Long crossed the Central Plains in 1819 and called them almost wholly unfit for cultivation, partly because of what grew there, partly because of what didn't. Near Chimney Rock, Oregon Trail travelers in the 1840s reported no fuel for 200 miles except dried bison dung they called buffalo chips, pressed grass and fermented roughage, dried flat by the sun, but it burned, and hotter than most people expected. By 1862, when the Homestead Act opened the floodgates, the crisis was already waiting. In that year, the Nebraska Advertiser out of Brownville printed a notice that would make your eyes water. Corn was selling at 10 cents a bushel, coal was 20 cents, and firewood, if you could get it, ran $2 a cord. $2 meant many families simply couldn't afford it, which made it cheaper to burn your own corn crop, and some of them did. What they burned instead was everything they could lay hands on. Buffalo chips came first because the bison had covered the plains in their tens of millions and left a continent's worth of dried dung behind them. A bushel of chips could be gathered in a minute, and 3 bushels made a decent fire. Families stacked them in piles 10 and 12 feet high next to their sod walls. Women and children did most of the gathering. Primary accounts from the period put it plainly, that chip collecting was women's work on the frontier. Men were in the fields, women filled the fuel pile. Then the bison were gone, slaughtered down to fewer than 1,000 animals by 1889, and the chips with them. Settlers switched to twisted hay, and cats they called the twisted bundles. A man in Dakota Territory patented a hay-twisting machine in 1876, and by 1878 manufacturers were selling specialized hay-burning stoves. The problem with hay as fuel is speed. A haycat burns in 4 minutes. You feed the stove constantly or you freeze. Charlie O'Keefe, who homesteaded in Nebraska and wrote about it honestly, described it this way: "Stoke the stove, get out the flour sack, stoke the stove, wash your hands, mix the dough, stoke the stove, wash your hands from before sunup until after dark, every single day." Corn cobs burned better. They're actually energy dense, about 8,000 British thermal units per pound when dry, comparable to hardwood, but corn required land cleared and planted, which took years, and buffalo chips required no investment at all. So chips came first, hay next, cobs eventually, and all three plus anything flammable a family could beg or scavenge. And in the upper Midwest in Minnesota, northern Iowa, the wet edge of the Dakotas, there was one more option that most settlers from Virginia or Ohio or New York had never thought of at all, one that Irish and Scandinavian and Finnish immigrants recognized the moment they stepped into the landscape: peat. Minnesota sits on more than 6 million acres of peatlands. The State Geological Survey documented it in Bulletin number 16, writing that there was enough peat to produce more than 6 billion tons of usable fuel. Bogs and fens, some of them thousands of years old, ran from the northern lake country down into the agricultural counties where homesteaders were filing claims. You could walk across one and feel the ground give under your weight. Underneath the root mat, sometimes 2 and 3 meters deep, was dense, dark, compressed organic matter, dead sphagnum moss, sedge, wood fibers, all of it slowly becoming something that burned. Irish immigrants who settled Stearns County and Benton County in central Minnesota knew this ground on sight. Their families had been cutting peat in County Mayo and County Clare since before anyone could remember. The Norse settlers from the Trondheim region knew it too. Norway's coastal bogs had fueled farmhouses through centuries of hard winters. When these families looked at a Minnesota wetland, they didn't see a swamp, they saw a fuel depot. The process was straightforward and demanding. You cut a surface strip first, the living root layer, 30 to 60 centimeters of grass and tangled fiber, and set it aside. Underneath was the good material. You cut it in blocks, roughly 5 inches by 5 inches by a foot long, using a narrow, sharp spade designed for the work. The blocks came out dripping. You stacked them loosely in rows and let air move through them, turned them after 3 weeks, then again after another 3 weeks, and by late summer, 4 or 5 months after cutting, they were ready dark brown, firm, reduced by half their original size as the water left them. At full air dry, around 25 to 30% moisture content, a peat brick delivers somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 British thermal units per pound, which is in the same range as air-dried hardwood. The difference between peat and hay is not the heat, it's the duration. Hay burns in 4 minutes, while a peat brick burns for 30 to 40 minutes, slow and steady, with coals that hold heat for hours. A firebox loaded with peat before bed will still have live coals in the morning, and hay requires constant attendance while peat does not. Well-dried peat at 20% moisture reaches 7,000 to 7,500 British thermal units per pound. Compressed peat briquettes, blocks pressed mechanically to drive out more moisture and increase density, push higher, sometimes above 7,700 British thermal units per pound, and hold about 3 times the energy per unit volume of loose peat because you can pack more into a given space. What peat also does, which hay and chips do not, is ignite reliably, burn clean, and stay lit. You can bank a peat fire the way you bank coal, which is something hay simply doesn't allow. Ernst Voss had understood this. He'd grown up outside Flensburg, in the German-Danish borderlands, where peat was called torf, and every farm family within 10 miles of a bog knew how to cut it, dry it, and stack it. When he and Ida arrived in Stearns County in the spring of 1888, he'd filed his Homestead Act claim on 160 acres that included the southwest corner of a shallow fen soggy, worthless for grain, Everyone in the county knew it. He'd paid $1.25 per acre for it, and people thought he'd overpaid. For 3 summers, Ernst had worked the fen. He cut blocks in May and June, turned them through July, hauled them dry in September. By the fall of 1891, he had the stone silo behind the house packed from the ground floor to 9 feet up with dried peat bricks, roughly 8 tons of them. He'd designed the silo himself, round, stone walls 2 feet thick, a cedar plank roof with a tin cap. He'd told Ida it was the best decision he'd ever made, and then he died of pneumonia before the first real snow of that year, before he ever used a single brick from it. Ida had known the silo was there. She'd watched Ernst build it for 3 years. But she'd never opened the access door herself and didn't know what was inside. She thought it was silage, the chopped corn fodder Ernst had been experimenting with for cattle feed. When she pulled open that iron latch on March 14th, 1893, she was honestly expecting to smell fermented corn. What she smelled instead was dark and earthy and old, like creek mud dried in the sun, like the floor of a forest after rain, nothing unpleasant, nothing alive. And when she held up her lantern, she saw them stacked floor to ceiling, row upon row of dark brown rectangular blocks, each one about the size of a small loaf of bread, dry and firm and odorless. She picked one up. It was lighter than she expected. She pressed her thumbnail into it, and it didn't give much. She carried one back to the kitchen, opened the stove grate, set the brick on top of the dying ash bed, and watched. It caught slowly, a thin blue curl of smoke at first, then a yellow flame that grew and steadied, then something she hadn't seen in 4 days, a real fire, the kind that didn't demand feeding every 4 minutes. She put 2 more bricks in and closed the grate down halfway. The thermometer above the stove moved from 58 degrees Fahrenheit to 71 degrees Fahrenheit in 40 minutes. She sat down at the kitchen table and did not cry. She was not that kind of woman, but she did sit there for a long time. The next day she went back to the silo and counted what she had. 8 rows wide, 9 feet high, roughly 12 bricks per stack, and the silo's interior diameter ran 14 feet across. She did the arithmetic on a piece of brown paper from a flour sack. 8 tons, approximately, if Ernst's blocks averaged the weight of the ones she'd tested. 8 tons of peat brick, burning at 2 to 3 bricks per hour in a banked stove, was more fuel than she needed to last until May, and not by a small margin. She felt 2 things about this almost simultaneously. The first was relief so complete it was almost physical. The second was something colder and more specific. She was furious at herself for waiting 18 months to open that door. She didn't tell anyone, not the Browers, not the Kesslers 2 miles east, not the families at the Lutheran church in Albany Township. She just started burning. And because she no longer needed to tend the stove every 4 minutes, she had time to do other things. She fixed the draft on the kitchen stove, which had been pulling unevenly since November. She repaired the chinking between the logs on the north wall, where cold air had been seeping in at the rate of a sustained draft. She caulked the 2 windows on the west side with rags and lard. She insulated the base of the house's stone foundation with packed straw, 3 feet deep on the outside, held in with boards. The effect was noticeable. The house held its heat differently. Here is the physics of what she did, because this matters. A house loses heat in proportion to the temperature difference between inside and outside, and in proportion to how easily heat moves through the walls, floor, and ceiling. The technical measure of how well a material resists heat flow is called its R value, and a higher R value means slower heat loss. Rags and lard in window gaps don't sound like much, but air infiltration, cold air pouring in through every crack and gap, is responsible for 1/3 or more of a typical house's total heat loss, and stopping it matters enormously. The packed straw she pushed against the foundation blocked cold air from moving underneath the floor. Straw's R value runs about 1.5 per inch, and at 12 inches of packed straw against a stone foundation, straw being full of tiny air pockets that air cannot move through, she was adding R18 to the coldest, most exposed surface on the house. The floor directly above stopped feeling like it was drawing cold up through the boards. She'd freed up time by switching to peat, and she used the time to make every peat brick stretch further by losing less heat through the walls. And it worked the way arithmetic works. The number is the number. Henrik Brouwer noticed, though not in any way that troubled him at first. He saw smoke coming from her chimney at a steady rate, rather than the desperate, irregular puffs that had characterized it through February. He assumed she'd arranged for a coal delivery from St. Cloud. He asked her about it the last week of March when she came to collect her mail at the post road. She told him she had plenty of fuel and expected to make it to May without difficulty. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who believes he is being misled for reasons of pride. "Cord wood?" he asked. "What I have is sufficient," she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and she walked home. What happened in the first week of April, 1893, across Stearns County, Minnesota, is documented in the St. Cloud Daily Journal Press and in weather records from the United States Signal Corps station at St. Cloud. The air temperature on April 3rd was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. By 9 o'clock on the morning of April 4th, it had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. By 2 in the afternoon, it was 3 degrees Fahrenheit. That rate of collapse, 45 degrees in less than 30 hours, is what settlers called a flash freeze. Not a slow, grinding winter that announces itself weeks in advance, but a single catastrophic drop, the sky going the colour of a bruise, a north wind arriving like something had broken loose. You could smell it before it hit, an electric sharpness in the air, and then it arrived. And whatever wasn't already warm and ready was in serious difficulty. The Signal Corps had issued no advance warning. The drop on April 3rd looked like an ordinary spring cold spell, and no one was prepared for what followed it. Henrik Brouwer was prepared, in the sense that a man with 14 cords of oak and a cast-iron parlour stove is always prepared, but he had a problem the oak was not going to solve. His cattle shed a lean-to construction running along the east side of his barn had been built for winter weather that was supposed to be over by now. The roof, a flat pitch board and tar paper affair, was not designed for the wet, heavy snow that arrived with the cold front on the night of April 4th. 8 inches in 6 hours, dense and water-loaded. By morning, the southeast corner of the lean-to roof had buckled under the weight, dropping a section of framing onto 2 of his cows. They weren't dead, but one was badly lame and the other had a gash across her flank from a broken board. The flat-roofed lean-to had failed because flat roofs accumulate. Load the weight of snow has nowhere to go on a flat roof except straight down. A pitched roof sheds it. A curved or conical roof, the kind Ernst Voss had built over his stone silo, sheds it even more efficiently, because the snow follows the curve and drops away before it can accumulate to dangerous weight. Ernst's silo was standing without a complaint. The conical cedar cap had shed every flake. Inside that silo the temperature was around 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone walls, 2 feet thick, changed temperature slowly enough that the spring air hadn't warmed them yet, and the winter cold inside the mass of stone hadn't fully dissipated. A 40-degree differential between outside and inside, maintained entirely by the thermal mass of 2-foot stone walls and 8 tons of stacked peat, with no fire at all. That thermal steadiness is what stone does. Dense materials, stone, brick, water, clay, absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. Their ability to resist temperature change is proportional to how much mass they contain and what material they're made of. You can heat a stone wall all summer, and it will release that heat through the fall and winter, slowly and consistently. A thin board wall, by contrast, tracks outside temperature almost immediately, warming in an hour and cooling in an hour, with essentially no thermal inertia, while stone has enormous thermal inertia. The silo hadn't been heated intentionally, but it had absorbed months of ambient warmth through the fall and stored it in 2 feet of stone, and that stored energy was still fighting the cold in early April. The peat inside, stacked tightly enough that air couldn't move through it freely, added its own insulating effect. Peat's thermal conductivity runs about 0.06 watts per meter per Kelvin when dry, roughly equivalent to loose-fill insulation, which meant the bricks in the interior were buffered against the outer temperature by the bricks on the perimeter. Ida's house held 64 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of April 5th. She had peat burning at a banked rate in the kitchen stove and another slow fire in the small parlour stove. She'd loaded both the night before, closed the dampers down to about a quarter, and slept through the cold front without waking. Henrik Brouwer showed up at her door at 7:30 on the morning of April 5th. He was wearing 2 coats, and his breath was coming out in hard white clouds. He asked, without any particular warmth, whether she had any fuel she could spare for a few days. His woodpile, he explained, was adequate for his house, but it was his cattle that were the problem. The lean-to was open to the wind now that the roof section had come down, and he needed fuel to run a second stove in the barn to keep the temperature above freezing for the herd. Ida looked at him for a long moment. She invited him inside, set a cup of coffee in front of him, then went to the silo and came back with a wheelbarrow load of peat bricks, about 200 pounds of them, and told him to take what he needed and return the barrow when the weather broke. He looked at the bricks, picked one up, and asked what they were. She explained. The fen on the southwest corner of the property, Ernst's cutting operation, 3 summers of work, 8 tons of dried peat stored in the silo. Henrik Brouwer sat with this information for a while. He was a practical man, whatever else he was, and practical men don't waste time arguing with facts. He built the silo for the peat, he said, and it wasn't a question. I think so, Ida said. I don't know that he told me exactly. I thought it was for silage. I thought the same. Brouwer loaded the wheelbarrow and took it back to his barn. He returned it the next day with 2 dozen eggs and a smoked pork shoulder from his cellar, which he left on her doorstep without knocking. She found it when she went out to check the animals. She didn't read it as an apology, and she didn't need it to be one. What she needed, and what she'd spent the rest of April thinking through, was how to use the remaining peat most efficiently. She had roughly 5 tons left after the Brouwer loan and her own winter use. The weather had moderated by April 12th, temperatures back into the 30s and 40s, no more flash freezes. But she'd learned something through the winter that she didn't intend to forget. The silo was a better fuel storage building than anything else on the farm, and the fen in the southwest corner was a fuel source that could keep running indefinitely. Peat is renewable in the sense that bogs regrow. Though slowly, peat accumulates at about 1 millimetre per year. Ernst's cutting had taken material from the top 2 meters of a depression that was decades deep. She could cut it again in the same location within her lifetime, not from the same cut face, but from adjacent sections of the same fen. A managed peat bog, cut systematically and allowed to revegetate, can sustain fuel production over generations. She planned to cut again in May. She needed a slane, the narrow Irish peat spade, which she ordered from a tool merchant in St. Cloud for $1.40. She planned to stack the new cut differently than Ernst had. His blocks had been stacked too tightly in the silo's lower half, which had restricted airflow during the initial drying process. Some of the bottom bricks had dried slower than the rest and retained slightly higher moisture. She intended to stack the new cut on open wooden frames inside the silo first, allowing air to circulate from below, then consolidate to close-packed storage only after 6 weeks of initial drying, which would produce more consistent fuel with fewer wet bricks mixed in. She also wanted to extend the silo's effective thermal mass. The stone walls were already 2 feet thick, which gave them excellent thermal inertia against cold, but the silo had a weak point: the access door, which was plain pine boards on iron hinges. She planned to build a second door 18 inches behind the first, creating an air gap between them. That gap would act as a dead air buffer. Still air is one of the better insulators that exists, because heat moves through air primarily by convection, which requires the air to be able to circulate. And when you trap it between 2 doors, it can't circulate and becomes a barrier. The physics of dead air insulation is why animals have hollow shaft fur rather than solid fur. Each hollow hair shaft traps a pocket of air that doesn't move, and the animal's body heat can't escape through something that won't conduct it away. Birds have feathers that do the same thing. A down-filled blanket isn't warm because of the down. It's warm because the down holds millions of tiny pockets of still air that your body has already warmed. And you sleep inside a pocket of your own heat that the dead air refuses to let escape. An air gap between 2 doors is the same principle on a larger scale. The outer door blocks wind, the inner door seals the space, and the air between them, unable to move, becomes a significant thermal barrier. She built both doors before May. The cost was 12 boards and 8 hinges, total expense $0.83. The question of what the silo itself had done for the fuel inside it, why the peat bricks she'd found were in perfect condition despite sitting through 2 winters, since Ernst's death comes down to the stone. Walls. Peat's great vulnerability is moisture. Dry peat at 20 to 25% moisture content delivers 7,000 British thermal units per pound and burns cleanly and steadily. Peat at 40% moisture content delivers roughly 4,700 British thermal units per pound, significantly worse and requires more heat to start, burns unevenly, and produces more smoke. Peat that has been rained on and dried repeatedly will case harden on the outside while remaining wet at the core, so it looks dry, burns partially, and chokes the stove with incompletely combusted material. Ernst had enclosed the silo with a cedar plank roof and tin cap, specifically to shed rain. The stone walls, which don't breathe moisture the way wood walls do, maintained a steady relative humidity inside the silo regardless of conditions outside. 2 Minnesota winters and 2 wet springs had passed, and the peat inside was in essentially the condition it had been in when Ernst stacked it. Firm, dark, moisture content low enough to burn cleanly. This matters because everything else Ida might have stored fuel in the woodshed. A lean-to, a board-sided outbuilding would have been subject to wind-driven moisture, fluctuating humidity, and in a lean-to or open shed, direct rain exposure in a wet spring. The cylindrical stone silo was the most protected storage space on the farm, and it protected the peat through conditions that would have degraded almost any other stored fuel. There's something else the cylinder did that flat-walled buildings don't. Wind pressure on a flat wall is perpendicular. The full force of the wind hits the surface directly. Wind pressure on a cylinder is distributed around the curve. The leading edge takes the highest pressure, but the force divides and flows around the circumference rather than hitting one surface all at once. Engineering standards put the difference at roughly 1/3 less load on a cylindrical surface compared to an equivalent flat surface under the same wind conditions. On a February day in Stearns County, with a northwest wind at 35 miles per hour, that difference meant the silo never creaked, never shifted, never developed the gaps and loosened joints that let cold air pour into a board-sided building. The silo's circular foundation resisted overturning equally from every direction. A rectangular building has a strong axis and a weak axis. Blow from the strong axis and it holds. Blow from the weak axis and the corners are the first to go. The cylinder has no weak axis, and every degree around the circumference is equally braced against lateral force. Fred Hatch had figured this out in Spring Grove, Illinois in 1876, when he'd built the first 2 circular silos in America after his original square pit design kept developing rot in its corners. The corners collected moisture. The corners trapped silage that didn't ferment evenly. Round eliminated the corners, and within 15 years, round silos were spreading across the Midwest because everyone who built one found it outperformed every other design for the same reason: no corners to fail. Professor Franklin King at the University of Wisconsin put it in writing in his 1891 construction bulletin, noting that round silos enclosed more space with less material and distributed pressure efficiently around the entire circumference. Ida's silo had been built before that bulletin was published. Ernst had figured out the same principle from experience with round stone structures in northern Germany, where centuries of building in low-lying, wet terrain had taught builders to avoid corners and flat walls wherever the ground shifted with frost. By the 3rd week of April 1893, 6 neighbours in Ida's section of Stearns County knew about the peat silo. Some were curious. A few were skeptical, in the way that people are skeptical about things they haven't seen work with their own eyes. Ole Hendrickson, who farmed a half section 2 miles north, stopped by on April 22nd and watched Ida load the kitchen stove. He picked up a brick, turned it over, pressed his thumb into it the same way she had in March. "Burns as long as oak?" he asked. "Longer than split birch," she said. "Not as hot as oak, but it holds. You bank it at midnight, you have coals at 6. He took 3 bricks home to test. He came back in 4 days and asked whether he could take a barrow load. "Take what you need," she said. "I have enough until the new cut dries." She did have enough, nearly 4 tons, by the time the weather held warm in late April, approximately 4 times what she needed to get through a normal spring cold snap if one came. She spent May cutting new peat from the fen and stacking it on the open frames she'd built inside the silo, letting it begin its long, slow drying before the door closed on summer. The property next to the fen entrance, the southwest 40 acres, was her best land for nothing except peat. It was too wet for grain, too uneven for pasture, too far from the well to be practical for kitchen gardening. Ernst had paid $1.25 an acre for it, when a surveyor had told him it was the worst parcel in the section. The surveyor had been right about grain and completely wrong about the parcel's value. Peat at $4 a cord was the going rate for firewood in Stearns County in the early 1890s. Ida was producing it for the cost of her time and the $1.40 slain, so by any reasonable accounting, the Southwest 40 was the most productive land she owned. Henrik Brauer understood this by late spring. He came back twice more before the end of May, each time with something in trade: a repaired fence rail, help cutting the ice-heaved posts back along the north line, a half-day's labour mending the east side of her barn roof. He never said anything that resembled an apology, and he also never again suggested that she might want to sell. She'd filed for final proof on her homestead claim in June of 1893. The land office at St. Cloud recorded it without difficulty. She'd met the 5-year improvement requirement: house built, land broken, crops raised, and a stone silo complete with a working peat fuel operation that had carried her through the hardest spring she'd faced since arriving in Minnesota. There is a science here that went unnamed in 1893, but that has a precise name now, and it's worth understanding because Ida Voss intuited every part of it through observation and inheritance. The concept is called BTU density British thermal units, the standard measure of the heat energy contained in a fuel. 1 BTU is the energy required to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit, and fuels are compared by how many BTUs they contain per pound. Twisted Prairie hay delivers somewhere in the range of 5,500 to 7,000 British thermal units per pound. It burns fast and burns hot when you first light it, but it doesn't hold coals, doesn't bank, doesn't sustain, and you need it constantly. Air-dried hardwood oak, ash, hickory runs 8,000 to 10,000 British thermal units per pound, the gold standard of settler fuel, essentially unavailable on the open plains except at freight costs most families couldn't absorb. Dried peat at 25% moisture delivers 5,000 to 7,000 British thermal units per pound, depending on how well it was dried and the composition of the bog. Less energetic per pound than oak, but a peat brick burns for 30 to 40 minutes, not 4. A pound of hay delivers its BTUs in 4 minutes, while a pound of peat delivers slightly fewer BTUs over 10 times as long. For home heating, for maintaining a steady temperature in a sleeping house through a cold night, peat's slow burn is worth more than hay's fast burn, even if the raw BTU number is similar. Compressed peat briquettes, where the moisture has been pressed lower and the density is higher, push towards 7,500 to 7,700 British thermal units per pound. Ernst's blocks, hand-cut and carefully dried through 4 months of Minnesota summer, probably landed in the 6,500 to 7,200 range, better than loose sod cut in wet conditions, not quite as good as commercially pressed briquettes, but consistent and reliable. The critical insight is that fuel value is not just energy content. It's energy content times burn duration divided by the labour required to maintain the fire. Peat scores well on all three compared to the alternatives available on the upper Midwest frontier, which is why the Irish burned it for 1,000 years, why the Finns burned it, why the Scots burned it, and why, wherever European immigrants who came from peat bog country settled in the lake states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, the ones who recognized the terrain and worked it the way their parents and grandparents had stayed warm when their neighbors were burning furniture. Ida Voss had not come from a peat-burning tradition. She was from a German Lutheran family out of Kansas who had met Ernst Voss in Chicago in 1886 and followed him to Minnesota on the strength of his certainty that the claim in Stearns County was better than it looked. She'd learned what she knew about the peat from watching Ernst work the fen for 3 summers, and from the evidence of 8 tons of dried bricks stacked in a stone silo that had outlasted the man who built them. What she knew about efficiency, about the stove draft, about the double door, about the straw against the foundation she figured out herself through the same process every good builder uses. Watch what fails and fix it. Watch what works and repeat it. What happened to the farms around Ida Voss's section over the next decade tells a broader story about the wood problem on the Great Plains and the people who solved it by paying attention to what the land actually offered. By 1896, 3 families in her township were cutting peat from the same fen system that ran through the southwest corner of her property. She wasn't the only one who'd known about it. She was the first one who'd made systematic use of it as a winter fuel source. The others had treated the bogs as drainage problems to be drained, not resources to be managed. Once they saw what she was doing, once they felt the heat coming from a peat fire and understood what it meant to have a stove that didn't need tending every 4 minutes, the conversion was not difficult. The railroad reached Albany Township in 1897, and with it came reliable coal from the Minnesota and South Dakota coalfields at St. Cloud. By 1900, most families had switched entirely to coal. The alternative fuel era was ending, and the peat bogs went back to being drainage problems. Most of them were ditched and tiled for agriculture over the following 30 years. Ida kept cutting peat until 1902, when she married a second time, a widower from Melrose named Albert Knutson, who farmed 240 acres and had a proper woodshed and a coal contract with the railroad depot. She'd stopped needing the peat. But she kept the silo intact and left the fen alone. And when she wrote to her youngest daughter in the winter of 1919, she mentioned the silo in passing, noting that the stone walls were still sound after nearly 30 years, and that the cedar roof had needed only 1 re-shingling. The fen on the southwest corner of the original Voss claim is still there, not farmed, not drained, a depression in the Stearns County landscape that looks from the road like nothing worth stopping for. The practical physics Ida Voss used to survive the spring of 1893 are not historical curiosities. Thermal mass, the ability of dense materials to store heat and release it slowly, is the foundation of passive house design. Every heavy adobe structure in the American Southwest, every rammed earth building in Australia, every stone farmhouse in France operates on this principle. The material absorbs heat when it's available and releases it when it's needed, and thick stone walls don't need a furnace running constantly, they need periodic heating, and the mass does the rest. Dead air insulation, still air trapped in small pockets, is how every modern insulation product works. Fiberglass, cellulose, spray foam, rigid foam board, all of them create barriers to heat movement by trapping air that can't convect. The double-door air gap Ida built cost her 83 cents, added an insulating layer that had no ongoing cost, and operates on the same principle that makes modern windows double-paned with an inert gas between the layers. Trapped gas that can't move, can't carry heat. BTU density. Understanding that different fuels deliver different amounts of energy per unit of weight or volume is how energy decisions get made honestly. Hay doesn't have less BTU content than peat because hay is a bad fuel. It has a different combustion profile that makes it wrong for specific applications, and the wrong fuel in the right stove still costs you more in labour than the right fuel in the same stove. Peat as fuel is not finished either. Ireland still generates about 8% of its electricity from peat-fired generating stations, though the last ones are scheduled to close by 2025 as the country transitions to wind and solar. Finland used peat for district heating systems throughout the 20th century. The FAO documented global peat energy production in technical detail as recently as 2003. The fuel Ernst Voss cut in a Minnesota fen in the summers of 1888, 1889, and 1890 had been keeping people warm in northern Europe for 1,000 years before he touched it. It kept his wife warm through a catastrophic spring 15 months after he died, and it kept warming her neighbours when they needed it enough to ask. The silo stood for 30 years. The fen is still there. The physics still work. Share project content SHENICH. Created by you SHEAAVOD. These styles were used. Text 10 Linus TT St.